Do you know how to extend displays for vowels by any chance?
I'm good on
Huh?
Shiny object.
There's no.
Okay, guys, we don't have to hear that.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I know. Oh, okay. I just. Oh, yeah, what I know. So, I did not know they were. I just know her from, she was there at.
Said the owls.
Maybe.
It's terrible.
I mean.
Like last time.
Oh, you got it.
I don't really have it, because I was hoping I could do it from here, but,
She just graduated.
Just hit the full screen and see what it does.
huh?
Hit the full screen button and see what it does.
Well, I want to.
Okay, Mary.
Find my donuts. The first show at the corner.
Something starts
Knocked out.
Right.
So it's kind of like a sculpture, but.
That's half the battle.
I get no, but it seems like there's somebody. You don't know anything. Yeah, so what do you?
Yeah, she does.
I don't know. I find it is, and she like I'm a tattoo artist, so she's a lot of resumes. I think she was kind of like this studio, like. One of the retired. So I definitely, I get that. I do have people ask if I like it though, so. I don't remember saying this, they'll serve through it and then they can use the. So that's how she hires you really great. So it's called. Building back where.
So that you're established.
Like websites as well.
Yeah, right.
So.
I
tell people.
Can I help? Or you got it?
I could use help. I really would like to have both displays. I don't know why everything I've plugged into.
Oh, both
Taking over. So I can run it here, but also share.
Yeah, and I think a lot of, yeah, a couple weeks ago. It's beautiful.
So,
Yeah, it looks really good. Yeah, everything's great.
No, every time I go to a show, yes, I put volume.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, the waiting line's right there and then. It's it sits up on the hill, kind of. It's potential to have that one in Carroll. My hope.
Yeah.
You know,
But it looks great.
it like that. It doesn't have
Yeah. It's really nice.
I want to
It's going hard. I'm just here now. Just like.
Yeah.
Yeah. First time I was like, oh, I'm starting to feel a little like anxious about.
You want my laptop?
You right now. I'm working on some.
It's on mine.
Sculpture.
Display too.
It's. Yeah, just like. I've got a joke for the word. Oh, I was on. Back on there.
Right.
Show me my.
What does that remove display from desktop mean?
Who's showing us here?
Where's that?
It's at the bottom. Stop Windows or music display will be available to make special purpose apps that need to use it, but it's off.
I have. Should have found one, but, so.
All right, whatever.
You made it to the end.
And well, under a lot of pressure, that's always first, this might break, but this won't.
And I don't know if maybe,
Why?
I mean, I see Kelly's bed, you know, so. But, you're.
Okay, that's fine. Right.
I asked,
Can you-
not,
I can't, but she can.
but I asked if I could start in September.
Get ready to advance this way. Well, I'm not talking. I'll be the one at the end. Okay, we're good. I think we really want to just record this anyways. That's what I'm recording. Just
So there's
the
nobody
client.
tuning in.
Uh-huh. Pardon?
There's nobody tuning in virtually.
So maybe, so, sorry.
That's okay. I don't.
That's great. You guys already are
Recording it.
Okay.
I would say
Got
that.
it.
I'm on the Sonics.
And I know John.
Oh, that would be very.
Okay.
I don't, but I do.
I'll text Jonathan and ask.
Oh, yeah. Is there room? Is there one?
I think so. What you doing?
You're
hoping you might be there.
perfect. Okay, good. Don't know why I'm not having duplicate displays. Cause I can't, it's not doing anything on my end, so I'm glad you're advancing. I don't know. It must be some weird.
It is with this setup.
Is it in? I don't remember it that being a thing before. This last meeting, I could see what. But I didn't plug into the owl.
Yep.
So the owl's probably.
That's probably
fucking it all up.
Are we doing an introduction or anything?
Yeah, I feel like, would you guys, I think it would be nice to have an introduction. Actually, Jamie, turn the lights back on.
Yeah, just.
It's been a while since I've seen you all, but I'm Sharon Bosley. I'm the executive director of the Basin Commission. So I oversee the cleanup and the restoration of the Superfund site. And I'm actually not really speaking today. I have wonderful counterparts that will hopefully break up the noise of me speaking. But this is Mary Renberg. She's the ICP coordinator for Panhandle Health Districts, and she's going to go through kind of the history of the site and the work that they do here. And then I have Kyle Richards back there, and he is the, I forget your title, trust manager?
Senior program.
Senior program manager. So he oversees the work that they do, boots on the ground for the remediation and the cleanup in the larger basin area. So you'll get to hear from both of them today. And then after they both speak, we're gonna hop in our cars and we're just gonna go around the corner and you're gonna go on a tour to the central treatment plant. And so that is actually one of the three largest loaders to the South Fork of the Coeur d'Alene that they did an upgrade to the central treatment plant to help clean up the acid mine drainage that was coming from Bunker Hill Superfund site and to clean up the groundwater under the large central impoundment area that is seated over there. So we'll get to go get out and move our bodies. Hopefully it's not raining. It is a kind of an outside thing partially. So hopefully if it is raining, brought a raincoat. I should have sent that memo. Sorry about that. But if you guys wouldn't mind going through the room and just introducing yourself to Mary and Kyle, I think they'd love to hear kind of, you know, obviously your names, but maybe what, you know, your background and all that. So maybe you want to start?
I'm Duncan and I'm like interdisciplinary conceptual artist.
I'm Sarah Thompson Moore. I do sculpture and public art sculpture for parks. I'm Jen Erickson and I do painting and drawing.
I'm Kate Lund, hi Mary.
And I draw and sculpt.
I'm Jason Fails. I work for the TEQ on their quarterly lake management program.
I'm Jenny Pizarro and I do mostly writing. And this is Caroline. I'm Mary Frances Stondelinger and I'm on the advisory committee for living.
I'm Bobby Lake. I work at the Carolina Casino in cultural tourism and I'm a tribal artist.
I'm Gabrielle. I'm one of the artists and I do murals and illustration.
I'm Christina Villagomez and I do illustration, tattooing, and sculpting.
Go for it, Jamie.
I'm Jamie.
I'm Adam Blake, the project director of Movement. I'm Mary Hanlon. I'm the program coordinator for the Living Lake project.
All right. So have you guys sat through a lot of presentations about the history of the site yet? Or just kind of read some stuff and a little combination? Okay. So I'm going to go through, I like to give some historical pictures and context and then kind of tie it into where we're at today. So to give kind of the full spectrum of where we started and what we're shooting for as an end product. So we can go ahead and hit the lights and we'll get going through this. So I manage the institutional controls program, and I'll kind of get a little bit more in depth with that and what that means. But this is a picture of the Bunker Hill lead smelter when it first went into operation back in 1917. And we'll be, you hear Bunker Hill a lot and Bunker Hill Superfund site. So I just kind of start with just the basics. What is a Superfund site? A site or an area that's the Environmental Protection Agency is identified as being contaminated with hazardous substances or pollutants. There's thousands of Superfund sites across the nation. The Bunker Hill site was placed on EPA's national priority list back in 1983, and cleanup activities began in 1986. The Bunker Hill is also home to the largest lead poisoning incident in U.S. history. So where is it? This is my administrative boundaries. So the Bunker Hill site is a very dynamic, ever-changing, moving area. But anytime people are doing construction activities, dirt disturbance, any sort of movement stuff, my program will issue permits to document that work. And so it's broken up into kind of what we call 3 areas. The upper basin, which is where a lot of the actual mine sites and mill sites started. We've got the box, which was the area that was most heavily impacted by the smelter emissions. And then we've got the lower basin where a lot of the stuff washed downstream and settled out over the years. So the history, hard rock mining began in the area in 1884. The guys were actually up in the Murray Gold Field working those deposits, and then they started to branch out looking for additional gold. When they got to the Silver Valley area, starting in Burke, they realized there wasn't a lot of gold, but there was a lot of silver, there was a lot of lead, and there was a lot of zinc, which in the early days they didn't know exactly what to do with, but eventually picked up on that. The Silver Valley quickly became one of the largest and richest silver producing regions in the world. And the Bunker Hill mine was the largest lead and zinc producer in the US, accounting for 20% of all lead produced here. So this is an aerial shot of the Silver Valley. This is the Idaho-Montana border, and then Cataldo is kind of where the valley ends. Each one of those black X's is a mine. So you guys can get a sense of how many mines we had here in operation producing byproducts, waste products. And in the early days, the processing methods that were available were not very efficient. It was a lot of hand sorting, archaic tools and equipment. They didn't have the technologies to really remove a lot of the ore from the actual rock bodies. And so they did a lot of hand sorting, used different like jig tables and equipment things. And it could only remove 20 to 50% of the metals from the actual ore body. And then that leftover processed material is what we call mine tailings. That's what was then just discharged down hillsides, in streams, into creeks, because it was just convenient. We're in a very narrow valley up here. There's not a lot of flat ground. The mines actually knew technologies were going to improve, and they wanted to stockpile a lot of this stuff so they could reprocess it. But a lot of these places, we did not physically have the space to do that. So it became more of a convenience thing. Common industrial American practice everywhere. It's a river. You throw things in and then it washes away. So they weren't necessarily doing it to cause harm or issues. It was more of just a practicality standard. So this is a picture of the morning mill up in Mullen. And this is a pretty common mill setup historically. You have the rail line here. A lot of these mines are up in the mountainsides themselves. So you have to transport them down to the mill. The mills were located along the water because they needed water in those processing methods. So after they would process all the ore, And then that waste stuff would be just dumped, discharged through that flume straight into, this is the South Fork of the Coeur d'Alene River. So when you guys came into town, that's the river that you crossed over the bridge when you came to this office. This is the Pittsburgh Mill. This is up Black Cloud, 9 Mile Canyon. And same thing, you've got the rail line up here in the background, bringing it through to the mill. And then you've got a discharge point there. And then you've got another one coming down here going right into 9 Mile Creek. Very, very common. And this is the standard Mammoth spur line where they've got the ore cars and they're getting loaded up from the mill itself. So they use water to push the ore into the ore carts, and then they'd haul those down to the smelter where then they would be processed. But you can see it's just spilling, all that excess water then is just spilling out of the carts and going right into Canyon Creek. This is Bird Canyon. And it's got that milky gray color, which is what the rivers around here ran like until the late 60s. And then this one is Black Bear. This is also at Burke Canyon. And this is more of just the mine. It's not a mill, but just all that waste rock that they're just putting down the hillside to get rid of right into people's backyards. And you can see, I mean, that's essentially what everybody's built their houses on top of, is just this mine waste rock. So here's some of the numbers. 2,200 tons per day was discharged into the South Fork of the Coeur d'Alene River. Approximately 100 million tons of mine waste was discharged to the rivers and the water bodies in the area, covering thousands of acres of land. That waste included 2.4 billion pounds of lead, and mine waste is still abundantly present across the region because of that. This is the Bunker Hill celebrating the opening of their new flotation disposal line. They're breaking a bottle of wine on the top of it like you do with a new ship, christening it. So, celebration. This is a shot of the Smelterville area. So when you guys, if you're coming from Coeur d'Alene, you pass through Smelterville right before you get to Kellogg. So this is where Walmart is. This is where Jitters, and we used to have a grocery outlet. Now that's closed down, but so the freeway comes right through the middle. The airport sits up here. This is the Rails to Trails, the Coeur d'Alene. That's the old rail system there. But this is just showing you the valley floor and kind of how inundated it became with this mine waste after years of these practices. And then as our communities grew, we do have pretty steep mountainsides, so it's easier to build on flat ground. So we started to push further out to these flat areas and just built right on top of these mine wastes. And then of course, flooding helped spread and move that material around, especially, you know, you got to think about, we had several big, massive fires, forest fires here in the 1890s, and we had the 1910 fire. And so a lot of our forested hillsides were completely decimated by these fires. And then on top of that, we were logging to create housing, timbers for mine support, that kind of stuff. So a lot of our hillsides just were barren. And so when we had these heavy snow years, heavy rain, there wasn't a lot of vegetation to help absorb that. So we had a lot more frequent flooding happening. This is Kellogg. Now this is looking east. So I always tell people like that are from here, this is the old Sunnyside School. This would be like where Dave Smith's main office building is. But you can just see the river, the waters get pretty far into the community. And then this is Osborne, the floodplain in Osborne, also looking east. And this was a plank dam that a group of mines joined together, known as the Mine Owners Association. And they were attempting to address some of the environmental and human health issues that did start to suddenly appear. So they started working with different experimental methods to try to slow down the movement and migration of this mine waste. And they had a series of plank dams that they constructed through the valley. Essentially what they created was more of like a tailings impoundment area behind the dam, so to spread out wider. And then as soon as we had a high water event in the spring, waters would bust right through them. And so they abandoned those in the early days. Another attempt was a suction dredge that they operated in the Cataldo area. This was, it kind of floated around this pool and worked this area, trying to capture the tailings. I know, right? But trying to capture the tailings and removing them from the water before they got further downstream into what was known as our agricultural region, where we had a lot of our livestock, a lot of our ranches, a lot of the different harvesting fields and things like that. So they were trying to get that material out of the river before it reached that lower basin region. And then they piped it and discharged it into a whole old wetland area My grandma actually used to go swimming out in a little pond out there in that area. She remembers as a little girl when their pond got filled in with the mine waste, and she was just so disappointed. That's one of the stories that sticks out in my brain when I see this picture. So the very first lawsuit that was filed against the mining companies for some sort of damage happened in 1903 from an area farmer, and then a group of farmers joined in a few years later to do a class action lawsuit against the mines. And this was for loss of their crops, livestock dying or getting sick, and destroying their water, their clean drinking water. Because mining was such an economical force and so important to the growth of Idaho, the courts ruled in favor of the mines, but they would have the mines pay the farmers like, okay, every cattle you lost, you get 50 cents, or every acre you got, you get 10 cents. Very minor retribution for the damages that were done. Most of these farmers ended up abandoning their lands and having to move off and do other endeavors because it just wasn't feasible to continue farming. So that dredge area, you can still see today. So this is where the Old Mission State Park is, the Cataldo boat launch, that you can actually see the mine waste of the area that it filled in. And that's over 2,200 acres up to 30 feet deep of that mine waste. So when you come through I-90 there, you're driving right across it. ITD actually paid the dredge owners to move their discharge point to create the berm that I-90 was built on top of. We used to have some really nasty dust storms out there in the 70s, I guess, before there was vegetation, caused car wrecks and stuff quite frequently. So, and this is a shot of that area in the spring when the water levels were really low a few years ago. You can actually kind of see the seepage and the metals getting into the water. In the summertime, when everybody's out there swimming in this area, the water's up high, so you can't see these actions happening, but it's kind of interesting to be able to go out there in the wintertime and see what's actually happening. And of course, you guys have learned about the lake and the fact that the river carried this contamination all the way into Lake Coeur d'Alene. And this is the discharge point of the river. Here's the town of Harrison at the bottom. And that was back in the 60s that this picture was taken. In addition to the river waste, we also had airborne emissions. So we had the Bunker Hill lead smelter in the zinc complex. Smelting is essentially the process of applying heat to an ore to extract those base metals. The smelter began operating in 1917, creating an air pollution problem almost immediately. But the Bunker Hill company employed 2,100 people in its heyday and boasted a $50 million annual payroll. They were the Union Pacific Railroad's biggest shipper, and they were Washington Water Power, now Avista, their largest customer. So just a massive employment opportunity for this small community. And so many people relied on the bunker for work. That's again, I-90 right there in front. But where they chose to put the smelter is in an area where we have frequent inversions. So we have these air weather systems that get trapped in the valley floor and we just get socked in. And so this was a pretty typical day when the smelter was running and we had one of those inversions going on. My family that was, grew up here talked about when it was like this, you could just taste the metals in your mouth. The schools would actually give the kids gum to help break that up. And not a lot of bugs, not a lot of birds, a lot of the wildlife just kind of stayed out of the area in general. So my grandma did tell me when she left the hospital with each baby, she had 4 kids, that they told her there's an inversion going on, do not take your baby outside, they can kill the baby. And that was just kind of part of her discharge orders. And these emissions did contain the metals, but they also contain sulfur dioxide, which when you add water becomes sulfuric acid. So we had an acid rain issue. And so all of our hillsides that were in close proximity to the smelter became denuded of vegetation as well because the soils became too acidic to support life. This picture is actually taken in 1992. So this is 11 years after the smelter shut down, before some of the replantings and stuff had taken. Just another shot, just how different it looks coming into town today versus even back in the 90s. So smelters in general have pollution control systems that are known as bag houses. That's typical for all smelters. It's the primary pollution control and it filters stuff out before it enters the atmosphere. This is the inside of what the bag house was. So they're 11-foot long bags that hang from the ceiling down to the floor. And it's essentially like an old vacuum cleaner back when we used to change the bags in vacuum cleaners. Same concept. The dirty air goes in, it gets filtered out through the fabric bags. Then the clean air gets discharged. And then they would change the bags out after they got full. They would process those metals and then change them out. Well, what happened is in 1973, we had a fire that burnt through a huge portion of the bag house and destroyed a lot of these filtration units. The company at the time made the decision to continue operating the smelter and in fact increase productions because metal prices were some of the highest they had seen in decades. So they were making great money and I always want to point out that the people that made these decisions, and I'll get a little bit deeper into this in a minute, but they were not the local executives. These were guys that were sitting in their offices down in Texas and LA. They did not live here. They did not grow up here. They were people that really didn't have their hearts invested in this community. So those are the types of people that were making those decisions, not the local management folks. The particulate emissions, the lead dust, went from what was normally 8 to 12 tons per month up to 36 tons per month. And those particulates contained 50 to 70% lead. We immediately started having children hospitalized with lead poisoning. And that is what brought the attention of state and federal officials to start looking at Kellogg and go, what the heck is going on here? So in 1974, they started a blood lead monitoring program for area children. Panhandle Health teamed up with the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare as well as CDC. And 99% of the kids that they tested that lived within a mile of the smelter had clinical lead poisoning. The community average at that time was a 68.3 micrograms per deciliter of lead in the blood. To give you a reference today, we want all of our children to be less than 3.5. We don't want any amount of lead in the body. It doesn't benefit us in any way. But because it's such a readily abundant element in the environment, it's almost impossible not to have some sort of exposure. So CDC has 3.5 as the level set right now. They're actually talking about lowering it again. When I started this job, so I've been here for 14 years. When I started, the acceptable level was 10, and then I saw it go down to 5, and now it's at 3.5, and now they're talking about lowering it again. So it's been a progression even in the short time that I've been here. So during that time, the company actually calculated the potential liability costs for poisoning area children. They calculated it would be $7 million to pay 500 children off for their health issues. They compensated local farmers for the death of 9 horses during this time, and they actually took that family and moved them to Cataldo, which is ironic because they lived in Smelterville. The Smelter Heights is what it was called. They took that whole family, moved them down to the Cataldo floodplain where it's just dominated, but it wasn't smelter smoke. So, and that family still owns that property. In 1974, profits totaled 26 million. And when this was happening, the company began to secure industry experts who would be sympathetic to their side for any sort of medical studies. I just threw this one in. It's not great quality because it's an old copy, but Seattle Post. So if a pervert poisons a child, that's called child abuse. If a corporation poisons it, that's called maximizing profits. That was an interesting old one. Rather than upgrade and improve the filtration systems, they fixed the existing bag house, replaced all those. That took several months to get all of it done, over a year to get the whole thing fixed. And then they decided to build taller stacks to help them try to meet the newly implemented air quality standards that the state was putting out, well, the feds and then the states were putting out. So those taller stacks were constructed in 1974 to try to get the smelter emissions up and out of that inversion area and away from the valley floor. The tallest one was 715 feet. The other one was 610. And even with these, they had conflicting industry expert advice on if this was going to work, if it wasn't. I mean, they weren't treating anything differently. They were just pushing it further up into the atmosphere in hopes of diluting it. So obviously that's not going to work. and they were never able to meet those air quality emission standards. In 1975, after the baghouse and stuff occurred, they actually implemented a policy banning fertile women from working at the smelter or the zinc plant. You had to prove that you were no longer of childbearing age, or that you'd had a hysterectomy, or some other form that showed that you could not have children. So I touched on this briefly, that the people making a lot of these decisions were not local. So in the early days, like back, not early days, but in the 60s, Gulf Resources was the company out of Texas that did a hostile stock takeover, and they had no local ties. And they're the ones that kind of were making these decisions. British financiers, David Rowland and Graham Lacey, had financial control in the final years and are accused of stealing the company's wealth. From 1989 to 1995, the company went from a $200 million in the bank to filing bankruptcy. And instead of paying for pensions, health insurance, and environmental cleanup money, was actually transferred a lot of money to overseas accounts and places like New Zealand, where they bought up real estate, a British retail chain store, Scottish castle, sunken treasure in the Arabian Sea, and a whole bunch of stuff down in Australia. One of the guys started a church in Australia. So then he didn't have to pay he was tax exempt too. Like, there was all this crazy freaking stuff going on. And then they just wiped their hands clean of it. So like, I have family members that worked at Bunker their whole lives, and they lost their pensions. They lost everything that they had worked for, and they had to start over fresh. It's crazy. So kind of getting back to, what the whole center of what my program does. We're here to protect human health, obviously, as a public health agency. So how do lead and arsenic affect the body? Lots of variations depending on your genealogy, your genetics, your diet, exercise, body makeup, all these different things. But the Bunker Hill is actually studying their own employees because they saw that there was higher rates of incidence of certain diseases and such. So a study of the smelter workers between 1940 and 65 that found that kidney disease was 4 times higher than US rates. Death from kidney cancer was nearly double. Deaths from strokes were 1.5 times higher. And Shoshone County had the highest cancer rates for decades, and we still balance between the top 2 in the entire state. So it is bleak when you look at that stuff, but I always want to tell people this is the bad stuff, and we're going to start getting into the better positive stuff now. In the early days, the mines did recognize that they were causing human health problems, and so they did try to come up with different solutions. They had the solarium, which was the sunrooms that was at the Wardner Hospital, and once a week they would bus up area school children and the workers and have them put on their little skirt guys there and then put on goggles. They'd go, that's a conveyor belt, and they'd stand and go through and get their ultraviolet light treatment. The thought there was because lead mimics calcium and vitamin D in the body. So they were trying to increase those levels by giving them vitamin D from the sunlight treatment, and then they provided them with free milk for the calcium. So that was a combined effort to try to reduce the absorption rates of the lead. They also had the electrolytic treatment where they would have the smelter workers put their hands and feet in a saltwater bath, run 110 volt current through it, and they thought that would draw the metals out. It didn't work, so they abandoned that quickly. So these are just kind of ideas of yesteryear. So they were trying things. But in addition to the river waste, the air pollution, we also had the human element of moving this material throughout our communities. So this is a picture of black slag. This is actually what's left over after the ore has been processed through the smelter. This is a jar of black slag. You guys can pass it around. It's like a black obsidian sand, kind of how I would describe it. It's not very, like, the metal levels are not that high in it, but it is acidic, and we used it. It was so readily abundant that there's a big pile of it right below the smelter itself. We would give it out to the local, like, water districts, sewer districts, power companies, and they'd use that as bedding material for their lines. Also, we gave it out to the road crews, and we'd use it on the roads as our salting or sanding agent. in the winters. And it worked great on the roads, but it was very, very abrasive and rough. And my grandma talked about how everybody's front door, the carpet would be eaten away because you track in the black slag, and she hated that stuff. She's like, you can't vacuum it out, it's embedded in the carpet. And my grandpa would keep sandbags out at the back of his old rig that was a 2-wheel drive. I don't know why he had a 2-wheel drive in Idaho, but he'd just keep big old bags of black slag in there for the weight.
Sorry, what was it? What was it again?
It's black slag is what it's called. It is the leftover material after it's been smelted through the whole smelting process. Yep. And then we had all of these mine waste materials that were just readily abundant. So we used them for all kinds of construction. Railroad ballast, we used it as our actual road base. So this is a picture in Wallace of the horse-drawn carriages spreading the tailings from the Standard Mammoth mill across the streets. We used it in fill. So that was really common, especially back in the day when wetlands weren't a thing and we could just fill in a wetland and build a house on it. You could go up to the mines and you could load the stuff up for free and take it home. So it was used all over the place. We also used it in concrete and in bricks and in asphalt. So after all those big wildfires we had up in the Wallace area, a lot of the old wooden buildings got replaced with concrete, brick, stone, so that they'd be fire resistant. So this is the Wallace Concrete Company crew building their tailings bricks. So, and they have a certain look to them that you can start to recognize them, certain coloration and everything, but most of the buildings in Wallace were constructed with them. This is one of them. This is over 4,000 parts per million lead, over 900 parts per million arsenic. And I tell people, when they're bound up and locked up like that's not a huge issue unless you're licking walls. But the problem is that the bricks start to break down over time, right? And inside of these buildings, inside of any brick building, you'll start to see the crumbling dust layer that accumulates there. And I actually had one kid that had a high blood lead because he was going with his dad to a gym up here in Uptown Kellogg every day. And his child was a toddler, so he was crawling and he was just getting that lead dust all over his hands. It took us months to figure out where it was coming from, but we finally were able to identify it. So it can become a problem. And then I see these people use a lot of these in their gardens, their vegetable gardens, their flower gardens. The McConnell Hotel in Uptown Kellogg that burnt down a few years ago, that was tailings bricks. So I thought about all of that up in the air and everybody breathing. And so like nightmares. So how do we fix it? This is a pretty big problem, right? And it sounds pretty daunting. One of the first offers was to the community of Smelterville because Smelterville is one of the most contaminated areas from the smelter, right? They actually proposed moving and relocating the entire town, moving it to a cleaner place. And they were going to pay for everybody to do that. Community said, absolutely not. This is our home. Born and raised here. We work here. We're not leaving. You need to figure out a way to clean up around us. So we started looking at all these other alternative ideas. What could we do? And it's not an easy fix. There aren't any chemical treatments that you can readily apply to the dirt. There's nothing that you can do. You can't just radiate it away. There just was not a lot of simple solutions. So the best thing they came up with was to do what we call remediation. And it's a partial removal and replacement of these contaminants. That's where we come into people's properties. We dig down to a certain depth, remove those superficial soils, haul those off to an approved repository disposal site, and then replace that material with clean material. So essentially we're creating this clean barrier, this buffer that protects the community from what's still below. Sampling of the yard program started in 1989. And what they did to determine which properties would be remediated or not is they took samples down in different levels, 0 to 1 inch depth, 1 to 6, 6 to 12, and 12 to 18 to get an idea of how deep it was on that property. And then if materials tested over 1,000 parts per million lead or over 100 parts per million arsenic in the top 12, that's when they took action of removal and replacement. If soils beneath the 12-inch depth were still sampling over those thresholds, they would actually put in a visual barrier fabric so that when people, if they had to dig in their property, in their yards, they would hit this fabric and know they're getting into contaminants. This is the common current one fabric that's used. In the early days, they used a black felty material that was a lot thicker, didn't drain very well though, so they went away from that. There's also like a green color of this too that you'll sometimes encounter, but that's the typical. So each yard was sampled separately and each yard was cleaned up according to those sample results. Not every yard qualified for remediation. So I live in Osborne. My yard tested in the 300 range averages. And so my yard wasn't over that 1,000, so it did not get remediated. So when my kids were little, I had to be aware of my kids playing in the dirt in the yard because there was still lead there. And my son did have a high blood lead when he was in that toddler, all that teething phase. Their hands are constantly going into their mouth. They're in the dirt, they're down close to the ground, so they're breathing it in a lot easier. So those are our challenges. So just because a yard didn't qualify for cleanup does not mean it's lead free. I hear that from the community all the time. They're like, well, my yard's lead free, so I'm good. I don't need a permit. I don't need to do this. And I'm like, unfortunately, that's not the case. I have yards all throughout Pinehurst that tested 950 parts per million lead that did not get remediated, just right below it. Oh, this is a picture of the Rose Lake School when they were doing the remediation there. This one was a 12-inch remediation, but it did not qualify for that barrier fabric. But I do usually point out to people that a lot of times you can actually visually see when you're in the yards if a property's been remediated, because the dirt we brought in came from the Rathdrum Prairie area. And so it's got a lot different color and texture to it than our native soils. So a lot of times there's a visual clear mark. So we do have a variety of different remediation standards that are applied. We have greenings, which are just real thin or even. A greening can be a bare yard that tested 750 parts lead and they just put grass seed on it, get the vegetation. The goal is to keep people out of bare soils, out of those fine particulates. So you want a good vegetative cover. We have 6-inch barriers, we have 12-inch barriers without the fabric, and then the 12-inch with the barrier fabric. A lot of people will dig in their yard. If they don't see that fabric, they immediately think my yard was done wrong or it wasn't done at all. And so I have to go through that whole explanation with them as to why it doesn't. And it can be very confusing. But what I like to tell people is that, we've got this clean protective barrier that we're living on now. But as soon as if you were to pull that back like a blanket, these are the levels of lead concentrations that are sitting right below the surface in a lot of our counties. This is Smelterville. So this is going to be a little bit higher, but anytime you're near the floodplain where the river was carrying this, or if you're in the area where the smelter was operating, you're going to see these higher levels right below these barriers. So think about us living here. If you have a remediated yard and you want to dig and put in a fence, or you have a broken water line, or you want to have sprinklers put in your yard, it's not a simple process because now you're potentially getting into contaminated stuff and you can bring that up to the surface, it gets mixed around, and then you're recontaminating your property, which not only is a human health issue, but the banks do not want to loan on properties that have been recontaminated. So that can be a financial issue and burden as well. So it's not always easy living in the Silver Valley. So this cleanup being such a delicate, structured and system, that's why they created my department, the Institutional Controls Program. We're here as a locally enforced set of rules and regulations designed to ensure the integrity of these clean barriers, making sure that people, if they have to disturb them or if they're going to disturb them, that they're doing it right. They put things back together correctly and we document all of that. They call us the dirt cops. That's what our job is up here, the dirt cops, which I don't find offensive at all. I think it's funny. So the ICP, we are part of Panhandle Health, but we're not over like in the Hayden office or in maybe other allies. We're only here in Kellogg because this is where the Superfund site is. We did not do the cleanup, but we do have to manage it. So it's important to understand the decision-making behind it and the processes used so that we can work with community members today, because there's a lot of people moving into the area that didn't get to watch this happening. The cleanup was happening heavy in the late 80s through the 90s and early 2000s, and you could visually see it taking place. Now we have all these new families that didn't get to watch that. So it's really important to be able to explain that process and break that down with them. Our purpose is to protect human health, protect the remediation, and then we also assist with land transactions within the sites. Like I said, banks do not like risk. And so we work with all the area realtors to make sure that anyone looking to buy a property is given the proper disclosure. So it's federal law that you disclose the potential for lead on a property, whether that be lead-based paint, lead in the soils. And so we work to make sure that those disclosures are put together correctly. We've got all the information that's pertinent to that property so that that realtor can present that information and the people can make the decision, okay, I'm comfortable with this, I want to buy this property, and they know what they're getting into. But there is still a lot of contamination out there. So we also have to work on educating the public on how to protect yourself while you're working in your yard, or as contractors who are out there every day getting into this stuff on a continual basis. So when you ingest lead, your body absorbs 20 to 70%, depending on how full of a stomach you have, your personal digestive tract, your metabolism, and inhalation, almost 100% goes straight to your bloodstream. So those are the things that I tell people. These are the ways that you get exposed, either inhalation or ingestion. It does not radiate through the air. It doesn't absorb through your skin. You have to physically get it into your body, okay? So I show these ones to contractors so they can get more of an understanding as to how they could be getting exposed. They found that construction workers that work in lead environments that chew or smoke have a much higher absorption rate than those workers that do not. Recreating is also a big source of exposure because there's a lot of these areas. The river itself, how do you clean up a river? I mean, that's a whole nother area that's gonna be a long process. Kyle can talk to you about that. And then old mine dumps and stuff like that are super appealing to do hill climbs and ride your dirt bikes and all that fun stuff, ATVs. These pictures are actually taken from a festival that we have up here called Gyro Days years ago when we used to have mud pits, and these are up at the old morning mill in Mullen, some of the waste rock piles. So that was just part of our fun festivities. Not at mine dump, but it was before fire. But camping in contaminated areas, fishing, boating. Boating's not as dangerous if you're staying in the boat. I always tell people, don't be scared to go swimming here. It does not absorb through your skin. Okay, you can go in a boat, you can jump in. I raised my kids in a boat on the main Coeur d'Alene River their whole lives. We just didn't stop on the beaches. We stayed in the boat, and that's where we played. And then ATV riding, try to stick to clean areas. Go when it's wet out, so you're not creating all these plumes of dust. Or I tell people, be the first one in the line if you're going with a group, so you don't get on it. But some of our most popular recreation areas are some of our most contaminated zones. So this is a shot. This starts here, Smelterville here, going down the main Coeur d'Alene River to where it dumps into the lake. And these are the lead concentrations that are still present in the sediments along the shores and banks. And so this is a crosscut of the river, and you can actually see where pre-mining the lead levels were. So this is what the lead levels in the soil were here before we mined. And then the early days when the processing methods weren't as efficient, the levels are higher. And then as technology got better, those levels dropped a little bit, but they're still very hazardous. I do like to point out that I am not anti-mining. We need mining. It's an important industry in America and in the entire world. And modern mining is completely different than all these things that I just got done showing you. So modern mining takes into account a lot of different things. They have water quality monitoring, mandatory treatment of their discharges. They do annual employee lead health education. They do blood lead monitoring. They have showering facilities, laundry services for the guys that are working in the mills. And so this is a picture of a dry. When you work in a mine, very wet, very dirty. So during the guys' shifts, it's usually, a lot of them now are 7 days on, 7 days off. So for the 7 days, you wear the same set of clothing. And at the end of each shift, you hang it up and let it dry. So you're also not taking the stuff home to your families. They want you to shower at the mine, get rid of the stuff before you go home and potentially expose kids. We no longer have direct discharges into the river. We have tailings ponds. So these are impoundment areas where those waters are now safely collected, treated, and monitored so that we're not just reckless out there dumping stuff into the river anymore. This is the Lucky Fridays Pond 4. They're actually constructing Pond 5 right now. And then this is the Galena and the Coors Pond there in Osborne. And this used to be the Bunker Hills Tailings Pond. That was what we call the CIA, the Central Impoundment Area. We're actually sitting, my building's right there. So when you come out the parking lot, there's the toe of the CIA, but now it's all covered in grass and stuff. And when the bunker wanted to reopen, they asked if they could start using that again. Good, unfortunately, you can't. It's all been capped with clean. It's all, monitored. We've got the central treatment plant that you guys are gonna go see here in a little bit, all tied in with that. So I'll let them cover that more in depth. And then I just like to show you guys some before and afters of kind of where we were and where we are now. This is hole 3 at the Galena Ridge Golf Course. That is where the zinc stack, this is one of the shorter ones before they built the tall one. And when they demolished it, they actually fell both of them right into this, and then they covered it and buried it in place. So now you can play golf on top of it. This was the confluence of the North and the South Fork of the Coeur d'Alene River back. So here is the rails to trails. Now the Snake Pit restaurant's off to the right here. Here's the South Fork dumping in. And now it looks gorgeous and beautiful and clean and lush. We're making such huge improvements and changes. But there are still sediments left behind that are contaminated. This is the Interstate Callahan up the East Fork of 9 Mile. So it was back in the day when we went partying in high school, we used to go out to like the mine camps, stuff like that as kids. That's what teenagers did. And now it's these lush rolling hills that Kyle can brag about all of his group's work. The South Fork of Osborne, I showed you that one earlier, and there's what it looks like today. Totally different. Some of the Kellogg hillsides. This was actually some of the terracing that was being done. You can see the dozer there. Bunker Hill they initiated a reforestation program back in the 70s to replant the trees. And so that was their crews doing terraces because the new seedlings would just wash off the mountainside as soon as they planted them when it was steep like that. So they created these different terraces, which you can still see today when you go out there. And you'll notice that all the trees in this area are all the exact same height. That's because they were all planted in the same time period. This is the zinc plant. I was super stoked. I'm a history nerd, but so these chunks of rebar, when I climbed up there, I found them and I was like, so I tried to get it zoned in as close as I could, but this is the Success Mine Dump up the East Fork of 9 Mile. And then a rock down on the river by my house. So I just laughed hysterically when I saw that somebody had gone down there and sprayed it. I love lead on that one. Any questions? Yes.
From a health perspective,
Yeah.
is there a difference in the danger of the lead that's on the riverbanks?
Yes.
That stuff wasn't smelted. Yeah.
There's a big misconception in the valley that the bioavailability of the lead from the mines is harmless. Not true. Actually, miners are my #1 high blood lead patients. #1 person I see. The bioavailability of lead that is a sulfide in the sulfide form versus the oxide form, which is what after they smelt, it is much more bioavailable, much more readily uptake, easy to uptake. But our average for just going to the mine dumps and along the river, we're looking at like 30% bioavailability. When growing up, I was always told 0, maybe 5, 5%, but very low. It's 30 on average, and it varies depending on which ore body you're in and everything. But yeah, so that's a great question. But the smelter absolutely did make it even more readily available, more dangerous. Yes.
What is the tailing ponds? What are they lined with, and how do you kind of ensure that that's not going to leach out
Yeah.
eventually?
Depends on when they were built. In the early days, they would do like a clay liner, an impermeable clay liner. The central impoundment area was not sealed right and was leaking, which is why you guys are going to go see the central treatment plant kind of talk about that. More common ones, they do actually have liners installed. There's varying technologies, so there's a lot of different types. Some are more efficient than others, and that's where you get those loading areas into the river is where some of these places, the older ones, may be leaking or leaching. But modern engineering addresses that. so that it's not a problem. Especially they even account for when they cap it, making sure that when the rainwater hits it, that it's not gonna actually permeate through and then come out on the, on sides, things like that. Yes.
As the criteria recommendations have been lowered over time, have they talking about doing any more soil replacement on
Why did
places?
you have to ask that?
Right.
We are right in the midst of that happening. The national lead level, guidance has been changed. And we have no decisions at this point in time. EPA is just starting to have those discussions. Our hope and our goal is to prove that the remedy that we've applied here has been successful and it is working. And so we shouldn't need to go back and do more. I have lots of contractors that would love it if we did it.
I guess I mean, pick up the stuff that was at 950 instead of that.
And those would be the things that I would be interested in having discussions about, something like that. But like my yard that was 300, it does need to be touched.
Kids
Those,
are little.
well, my kids aren't little, but other people, like, we got a little baby here in the room. So yes, so that is something that is being looked at, but it's not gonna be just a overnight decision. It's gonna be community input, community involvement. We're gonna have meetings. So it's not a decision that's taken lightly. I don't know, Kyle, if you want to add anything to that. Okay. Oh, and look, we have the same picture. That sometimes happens when you have these presentations. You get a little overlap like that. Yeah.
I'll give that to Kyle.
Perfect, thank you.
All right, next up Kyle, and then I can get you Mary's contact information too. So as you digest this all, you can
Yeah.
reach out to her, I'm sure.
I do have business cards right here piled up.
Oh,
If you
perfect.
wanted to grab them.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Mary. Mary touched on a bunch of stuff that really will tie in a little bit to what I'm gonna talk about here today, which is the upper and lower basins of operable unit 3. So, I'm gonna talk a little bit today, give you an overview of upper and lower basin. Mary touched on some of this, but we'll refresh as we get into things. I'll talk about who the Coeur d'Alene Trust is and what our roles and responsibilities are. Before I even jump into that, right, the Coeur d'Alene Trust is one entity that's responsible for some parts of this Superfund site. There are so many other people that are working on this, from DEQ to Panhandle Health to the Basin Commission, EPA, the Coeur d'Alene Tribe, Restoration Partnership, USGS. The list goes on and on. So you're going to hear from me, but there's a whole lot of people that are involved in the work that I'm going to talk about today beyond just the Coeur d'Alene Trust. So I want to acknowledge that. I'm going to talk a little bit about some general project processes, right? Like, what does it take to actually get one of these projects from being selected for remedy to how do we actually get these done? I'll talk a little bit about some work we have going on in the upper basin, and then I'll talk about the lower basin. So just to reset the stage here, I'm going to talk again. Mary talked about this, the upper basin up here. We're sitting in Kellogg somewhere in here. The upper basin, this is where most of that historic mining and milling practices took place. The box operable units 1 and 2 here, and then the lower basin, which encompasses the main stem of the Coeur d'Alene River down to Lake Coeur d'Alene, the associated floodplain. So as those mining activities took place in the upper basin, that downstream transport, fluvial discharge, deposition in the Coeur d'Alene River itself, and the associated floodplains and wetlands continues to be remobilized during high flow events and during really everyday flow events in the lower basin. Who is the Coeur d'Alene Trust? So we were established in 2009 as part of a bankruptcy settlement between ASARCO, American Smelting and Refining Company, and the United States government. So ASARCO, Mary talked a lot about Bunker Hill. There were a lot of mining companies that operated in this area. So ASARCO was one of those companies that had substantial environmental liabilities. As part of their settlement, though, there was provision that the settlement establish a third-party trust so that the dollars from that settlement went into a trust that are managed by the Coeur d'Alene Trust, and we are the successors to ASARCO, responsible for funding, managing, and implementing cleanup within operable Unit 3. All of that work takes place under the oversight of EPA, the state of Idaho, a bunch of other folks. The total settlement amount was about $436 million in 2009. One of the interesting things about a trust, we're not a unique entity. There's numerous environmental trusts across the country. But with those dollars going into third-party trusts, we're able to manage those funds differently than the federal government. So our funds are invested. We've continued to grow those funds over time, which is going to maximize and greatly expand the amount of work that the Coeur d'Alene Trust can fund and implement in the Bunker Hill Superfund site. Beneficiary, this is like any other trust, right? You've heard of family trusts, there's always a beneficiary, an asset, and a trustee, no different from this trust. The beneficiary in our case, named in the settlement agreement, is the United States Environmental Protection Agency. And then the trustee, we have a trustee that sits over top of us, that is responsible for the fiduciary implementation of the trust, and that's Path Forward Consulting. So we're just like any other trust. We just do different things than a trust fund is, as you may typically think about it. I've got a few historic photos in here. Mary talked about some of these. This is a typical scene in the Upper Basin, a historic mine and mill location located up in the Burke neighborhood of Canyon Creek. So Mary talked about steep hillsides, limited ground to do much in. You can see steep hills with the mining activities and operations basically filling up the entire valley floor. You can see rail lines moving through here. In this area, there was 5 or 6 mines that operated within like an area the size of a few city blocks. So lots of activities and tight spaces. Okay. Project process and overview. What does it actually take? How do we go through these? What does it take? We know there's some contamination, but what does it actually take to get one of these projects off the ground? The first step is investigation and characterization. So how do we define the nature and extent? How much contamination is it? How deep is it? How far does it go? And I'm talking about some sites now where Mary touched on the yards cleanup, the community cleanups that removed 12 inches, replaced with 12 inches. At some of these source sites, these mine and mill sites in the Upper Basin, right? Large scale removals. They filled in valleys, they filled in drainages. So we're moving very large quantities of mine waste to clean up these areas. So we come in with drill rigs, we do investigation again. So we're drilling down sometimes hundreds of feet. Waste doesn't always go hundreds of feet, but to inform our designs, we're drilling down deep to get data. So that's going to define how much waste is there. It's going to feed into our designs about how much removals we may need to have. We're looking at things like groundwater concentrations, surface water concentrations. What are these sources? How do we start to design a remedy to clean this up? We then move into design. It's a pretty robust process. A typical design on one of these larger scale projects takes about 2 years to complete. Very regimented, regulatory agency reviews taking place throughout the process. So we fund and manage the design work, and then it's going out to DEQ for review and EPA for review, Army Corps of Engineers, a number of entities that are reviewing to make sure that everything's being done correctly. We then move to construction, right? This is when we start to see yellow iron hit the ground and we start to move contamination. We're moving contamination to repositories, which are the design facilities to manage these wastes in the long term. I have some photos coming up of some of that, and I'll actually answer one of your questions about, we have repositories in addition to the tailings facilities and how we monitor those, because it is a pretty robust system. Construction gets done, so right, we all pat ourselves on the back and we've done good and we move on down the road. That's not the case. We move into long-term operation and maintenance. So we're continuing to maintain that remedy that gets completed. So that can be vegetation or vegetation maintenance. If there's some sort of failure on the remedy, we're going back and maintaining that. And then the most important part here is effectiveness monitoring. So just because we got a project done doesn't mean that it's done. We're continuing to, there's a program in the Superfund world called the Basin Environmental Monitoring Program that is monitoring the effectiveness of the remedial actions that are taking place throughout the Superfund site. So we're monitoring things like surface water quality when we get a project done. Did we see that return that we expected to see? Did we see those surface water quality improvements? biological monitoring. Are we seeing the fish return to these places? Are we seeing the intended results of all this work that we're undertaking? And then an important part to keep in mind as we talk about some of this is this is kind of a buzzword, so to speak, in the Superfund world, but adaptive management, right? There's so much work to be done here, and it's on such a large scale that you have to be continually learning and refining your processes on how you go about this work, the work that you complete, and how you take lessons learned from one project and incorporate them into your next project. So it's not so regimented that we just start at project A and we're going to walk through, then things are going to change over time as we get new information. That new information is important into our planning and prioritization processes. If there's any questions, please don't hesitate to just interrupt me. I'm happy to stop and answer any questions at any time. I'm going to talk about the upper basin a little bit. This is where most of the historic mining and milling activities took place. There's a few primary locations that we're focused in right now. The 9 Mile Basin, so we have the community of Wallace down here. We have 9 Mile Creek Basin that runs up right here. And then one drainage to the east, we have the Canyon Creek Basin. These two tributaries to the South Fork Coeur d'Alene River are the largest tributary sources of heavy metals loading to the South Fork Coeur d'Alene River. So our source control work in the upper basin is heavily focused in the 9 Mile Creek and Canyon Creek drainages to address the mine and mill source sites that are contributing metals into the South Fork Coeur d'Alene River, ultimately into the main stem of the Coeur d'Alene River, and subsequently downstream Coeur d'Alene. As we move out of South Fork or 9 Mile and Canyon Creek, and I've got some photos coming up, but bear with me for a second. We're going to start looking more closely at the South Fork Coeur d'Alene River itself. Large source of metals loading continuing to be transported down the South Fork Coeur d'Alene River. But again, that prioritization process, we're generally working in an upstream to downstream manner as we address these sources, working our way towards the lower basin. And then in the Pine Creek Basin, we're continuing to enhance our knowledge of that area, continuing on with investigations to define nature and extent. A couple other things that aren't shown on the map here are repositories. So repositories are where we haul the contaminated materials to, both from the remedial actions that we complete, but also from programs like the institutional controls program. When somebody's going to be putting in a new foundation in their yard and they're going to be encountering contamination, we manage 3 repositories in the upper basin and a waste consolidation area, and then a repository in the lower basin. So those are free for the community to use, but also we're bringing materials into them as well. There's monitoring that goes on at those repositories, groundwater and surface water quality monitoring. So we're monitoring those twice a year. We have groundwater wells that surround them where we're sampling the groundwater, making sure that we're not seeing increases of metals concentrations in the groundwater or surface water as a result of our mine waste management at those repository facilities. So it's not quite into like your tailings question, but there's a lot of monitoring that goes on at those repositories to make sure what's happening is happening as intended. Talk a little bit about 9 Mile Creek Basin. This is Mary showed a big map with a bunch of X's on it. Again, down at Wallace down here, all of these yellow areas and then the light tan areas are areas and mine sites that were identified for cleanup in the 9 Mile Creek drainage. We completed cleanup of priority source sites, mostly down to here, the largest loading source sites in the 9 Mile Creek Basin in 2024. We're finishing closure of the East Fork 9 Mile waste consolidation area here in 2026. And we're continuing on with that RA effectiveness monitoring, right? There's these cumulative actions, 13 years of cleanup work. What are we seeing from this? Is there anything left to do in 9 Mile Creek? Or are we hitting those metrics that we want to see from surface water quality, biological recovery, all of those good things? The photos are a little bit small here, but just bear with me. This is the East Fork 9 Mile waste consolidation area. So a large part of these big source control remedial actions, right? Oftentimes one of the biggest questions is, what do you end up doing with this material? As Mary said, we can't make it disappear. So we have to put it into a facility that's been designed and engineered and will be monitored to make sure that these materials are safely managed. This is just a progression over time, not even quite from beginning. This was in the 2018 timeframe here. You can see this is waste material that's starting to, the slopes are starting to grow. Keep in mind where these trees are at here, and you'll see the progression over time. Here's liner material going on as we completed a phase of the waste consolidation area, so that's preventing any infiltration down into those mine wastes that have been placed. And this was at the end of 2024 here. So this area here is where these trees were at here. It's about 1.3 million cubic yards of mine waste that were put in here. For like scale, you guys are probably all familiar with like what a normal dump truck is. You've seen a dump truck driving down the road. That's 130,000 dump trucks. So it's a lot. It's large earth moving projects. But this is an important part of our cleanup in the 9 Mile Creek Basin, taking it out of those mine sites and getting it up into the WCA. This is, Mary shared a picture of this one. The success was just such a transformation here. These two photos are taken from approximately the same location. So you can see this large mine waste pile. The success site was the largest zinc loader in the 9 Mile Creek Basin. So this is before construction. By time we're done, you can see the creek's been reconstructed and these hillsides are now vegetated. All of this mine waste has been removed, hauled up to the WCA. The photo on the right looks like an interim during construction photo. Lots of conifer trees growing out here. So we get done with remediation, or the removals rather, excuse me, right? And then we're kind of left with like this almost blank canvas. So the stream needs to be reconstructed, the site needs to be revegetated. Seed mixes include a variety of native plant species, and then we're planting thousands of conifer tubulings, as well as willows and alders, riparian plantings along the stream corridor. Just another photo of what this progression looks like. This was at the Interstate Callahan when we got done with remedial action construction. The stream has just been reconstructed. This is actually just groundwater flowing into the stream. And then we see a few years later what this same area starts to look like as we see the recovery start to take place in the vegetation. And then just another photo just a little bit further downstream as we start to see these riparian plants come in, shade starts to come back in, and see some good things happening. Now going to move over to Canyon Creek Basin. Good. As I said, 9 Mile Creek just over on this side of the mountain. We now move to Canyon Creek. I showed that map that had a few mine sites on it. The Canyon Creek Basin, all of these yellow dots here are mine sites that were selected for cleanup as part of the Superfund project. So we're moving, generally starting up in this area, working our way downstream. I probably skipped over this in 9 Mile Creek, but these are really like multifaceted projects where we're addressing the ecological concerns, the metals loading to surface water, improving surface water quality, but also human health protection at the same time. You'll see some photos coming up where, right, there's residential populations, there's community areas up here where a lot of times these large mine waste piles that were left are either literally in people's backyards right across the street from homes. So in addition to this ecological protection, human health protection is a big component of the Canyon Creek Basin. We have a lot of projects currently ongoing in Canyon Creek in multiple stages of design, investigation, or construction. And these just keep going one after the other. And we plan to be in the Canyon Creek Basin for about 6 more years at this stage. So a lot of work left ahead of us. Repositories, I talked a little bit. I just think that these are so important to the work that we do. So we have waste consolidation areas and repositories. This is the Canyon Complex repository under construction here. As we're moving, this was actually a remedial action itself. So we're moving contaminated materials into a properly designed repository facility. As we move on, we can see final cover and waste slopes coming up and repository foundation ready to accept waste materials. And then this is what the repository looked like at the end of last year. So this is about 40 vertical feet here that came in over the course of one season at Canyon Complex Repository. Star Complex up in Burke, again, a large mine and mill source site. This is a 4-year project that we've been undertaking to address ecological concerns as well as some human health concerns. Water quality in Canyon Creek, as we think about it, above this star complex, water quality in Canyon Creek is actually meets water quality criteria. As the waters move through the star complex and our water monitoring, we start to see some upticks and water quality exceedances, and those exceedances pick up through the star complex and ultimately through the length of Canyon Creek. There's so many photos of this site, but I just grabbed a couple. This is as we're working on one of these mine waste slopes, removing materials, doing some regrading, getting cover soils and putting vegetation back on the slopes. And then at the end of the project, this is what it's looking like now after seeding. If you drove up there today, it's a solid grass mat with some trees starting to grow on it and things are starting to come back. Tamarack number 7 is another large project. It was a 2-year project in the Canyon Creek Basin, moving large amounts of mine waste. And then the photo on the right, what I want to point out is it's difficult to see, but this is after we've removed all of the contaminated materials throughout the floodplain corridor. Most removals through the creek corridor here were about 7 to 8 feet deep. And then as we got the creek rebuilt, this is near the end of construction last year. As you can see, we turned the stream back in. This is before any seedings happened, but kind of some almost landscape type transformations where there's a lot of work that goes into these big remedial actions. Talk about the lower basin. So I felt that there was try and spend a little bit more time on this because as we think about lead sources that continue to be transported through the system, the upper basin, these mine and mill source sites represent about 20% or so of the lead flux into Lake Coeur d'Alene, the lead loading into Lake Coeur d'Alene. The other 80% is coming from the lower basin. So it's a huge source. As these materials wash downstream, they settled in the riverbeds itself, and then redeposited throughout the floodplains, continues to be a huge source of contamination into Lake Coeur d'Alene. About 37 miles of river in the lower basin, with remedies selected for the riverbed and riverbanks, wetland areas, recreational areas, and then of course we have our repositories and WCAs. As we think about the riverbed, contamination in some of these areas, right? We remobilize through erosional forces, primarily during high flow events. It's happening right now. There's erosion going on, but during those large flow events is when we see huge increases in that lead load, mobilizing contaminants, washing them downstream, and in overbank flood events, redepositing in the floodplains of the Coeur d'Alene River. So I'm going to talk about a couple projects here related to riverbeds and riverbanks. Mary talked a little bit about how do you deal with the river. I'll talk about some things that we got going on there. I'm going to talk about the Cataldo Reach. This is the most upstream reach of the lower basin. I'm going to talk about the Dudley Scour Hole and what that represents, some actions that we're working on there. I'll touch in on some wetlands projects that we have going on as well. Before I jump into that, I forgot about this slide. The challenge of working in the lower basin changes a bit, right? In the upper basin, we're mostly uplands. We have roads, we can drive to these places, we can drill, we can get to locations. In the lower basin, as we identify nature and extent of contamination, things get a little bit more logistically challenging. This is a barge on the Coeur d'Alene River where now we have our drill rig mounted on a barge to be able to drill down into the riverbed, the cores of the river, and identify the contamination that may be present. Water monitoring, this is boat-based monitoring. So we're out there with boats during high flow events, collecting samples of the water to characterize the contamination that's in the water to help us prioritize our work. And then just sampling riverbanks. This is Mary showed the great photo of the full profile. Here you can see some more of that where you have these sort of cemented gravels with this very typical red staining, indicative of mining contamination in the area. The riverbeds and riverbanks, we're focusing on source control with riverbeds and riverbanks, right? I talked about the Coeur d'Alene River, presenting 80% of the lead load to Lake Coeur d'Alene approximately. So the riverbeds and riverbanks are source control. We're working on a couple things. Up in the Cataldo Reach, this is a typical example of an eroding bank up there. So this, what you see here is previously deposited mine waste that now make up the bank of the river. As it continues to be eroded, those materials are getting pulled into the river and moved downstream. So we're undertaking work. We're in design on a project now to implement some bank stabilization up in the Cataldo Reach to start to reduce that. It's a pilot project, as we call it. There's a number of things we want to learn about this, not only the effectiveness of it, but also as we start to tackle more and more projects in the lower basin, how do we actually do this work? You know, what does it take to be doing work on such a large river system, and how do we undertake this? And then the Dudley Scour Hole pilot project. So the Coeur d'Alene or the Cataldo boat launch is just off the screen up here. Mary shared the photos of where the dredge tailings were being dumped to out by the Cataldo Mission. This is just downstream. So we have about a half mile of riverbed here. This is the scour hole right here. We call it a scour hole. It's a deep hole in the river where the river is scouring the bed out and remobilizing these contaminants. We see about a 30 to 50% increase in lead concentrations in the river downstream of this area. So what this project is, how do we deal with this? Is we're in design right now on a project to begin to dredge some of those contaminated materials off the bottom of the river, and then we'll install an armored cap, like a stone cover over those materials to prevent remobilization of these materials. So they're very thick in this area. Challenge rate is the volumes that we deal with in the lower basin are so large. Complete removals is really pretty much infeasible in the lower basin. So we're in design on a project to address these eroding materials in the riverbed, implement it on a fairly large scale for a pilot, and then be able to scale that up as we work our way downstream. Again, ongoing monitoring, investigation, and adaptive management. Talk a little bit about pilot projects, right? So as we implement these actions, we're going to learn a lot from these. How do we do this work? What were the effects of it? Are there ways that we can improve this? These projects are going to start to answer those questions and allow us to scale up this work throughout the rest of the Coeur d'Alene River. Wetlands. Beyond the riverbed itself, we talk about all these materials that have been deposited throughout the floodplain. About 18,000 acres, I think, of contaminated grounds in the lower basin in the contaminated floodplain. So we've started some projects to address some ecological health and also at the same time provide some clean recreational opportunities. This photo on the right-hand side is actually a project we just finished up last fall. This is 700 acres of previously agricultural field, contaminated agricultural field that has been remediated and restored to provide clean feeding habitat for waterfowl and other wildlife in the area. I need to give a shout out to the Coeur d'Alene Trust. We do remediation, and then there's the Restoration Partnership that is heavily involved in a lot of the cleanup work or the restoration side of things. This is a collaboration across programs in the Superfund site to sort of take two aligned priorities and pool resources to be able to complete a very large project. So we're excited to see the continued progression of this wetland system. And then we have another one on board here where we're going to be addressing about 250 acres of contaminated land. Again, previously used as agricultural field, now being converted into clean feeding habitat and productive wetland habitat. Again, in collaboration with the Restoration Partnership. Recreational areas, we talked a lot about, some of the human health things. We're also addressing recreational areas in the lower basin. Recreational areas, you know, can range from boat launches to this was previously a beach area. Recreational cleanup in the lower basin presents a lot of challenges, because of the ongoing recontamination concerns. So we're prioritizing areas where we can implement remedies that won't be undone after one flood event. There's a lot of education that goes into this. Mary has a lot to do with that as well. There's a lot of signage in the lower basin. If you ever drive down there, you might see these bright yellow signs, caution, or even warning, warning people about the elevated lead concentrations. And then these recreational areas are aimed at protecting human health. So a lot of work going into these, but still a lot more to be done. And really, as we start to slow down the sources of lead in the river, reduce that recontamination potential, the ability to implement more complete cleanups at additional recreational areas will become available. I think I went fast. Yeah.
So I know that restoring the vegetation helps with the erosion. Does it help with removing contaminants at all? Like, do the plants absorb anything and take it out?
So that's not our goal with any of these, right? This is a picture here. So these source areas, a lot of these are complete removals. So the contamination has been completely removed at some of these source sites. So at that point, we're taking it back to natural vegetation. Mhm.
The area that you said just finished up this fall,
Mhm.
is that out by Black Lake?
Yes.
And that was huge, huge area, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's about 5 miles from one end to the other. Yeah.
And you guys just, what did you do there?
Ah, good question. So there's numerous remedy components in this. So there was areas of this. So this is the trail of the Coeur d'Alenes, the old railroad embankment. So there was areas of this property that were actually not contaminated before we got there. But there were large areas that were just above cleanup level. And then there were some areas that were more contaminated. So some of these islands and things that you see out here, some of those contaminants got consolidated in those islands and then covered with clean materials so that they're safe from any burrowing animals or things like that. And then some of it was actually through what we call a tilling process. So essentially soil mixing. We had a very thin layer of contaminated materials underlain by non-contaminated materials. So essentially mixing some of those materials to be able to do that. And from there, so that addressed our contamination. Then it was lots of soil moving to create the wetland habitat that was again designed in collaboration with Restoration Partnership, Idaho Department of Fish and Game, to create this complex wetland system. So address the contamination through consolidation or tilling, and then the regrading and the vegetation to create this wetland system. Does that answer the question? Okay.
Yeah, I saw that going on for the years and I never knew exactly what was going on. So, yeah.
Yeah, we got a lot of questions. Are we building a Walmart? And are these condos?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's awesome.
I have a question about up in the kind of the mountain sides around these canyons where all of the mine shafts were throughout the hillsides. Is there a risk when you're up there hiking for lead in the dirt up top, or is it just simply everything that was brought down and piled in the canyons?
Yes and no. So some of these sites, right, you'll see a lot of our work is focused right along the creek corridor because that's where we're seeing the largest sources of lead into the surface water or lead and other heavy metals. But these upgradient sites, there is contamination there. So it's not so widespread. Mary talked about the smelter a lot, right? There were no smelters operating up in this area. So there wasn't this airborne aerial emission, and an area of contamination generally stayed to where the mine waste was deposited right in that area. But the answer is there are areas of contamination associated with these more upland waste piles that are further away from the stream. Totally.
But it's really around the waste piles themselves, not so much the openings where the mines shafts were and things like that, where it was brought out of the mountain.
Correct, right? I mean, most of the, there's still ore body left in there essentially. But in terms of like what we can come in contact with, it's in those waste piles. A lot of those shafts and adits, so adits go horizontal into a mine, shafts go vertical, have naturally collapsed over time. There are discharges out of some of those, right? Groundwater discharges as the mine cease production, they fill up with water, they discharge water. You'll learn about some of that at the CTP, I'm sure. So you do have contaminated surface waters in some instances exiting these mines, that is also selected for remedy as part of the Superfund work. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess I've always wondered about, because I hike or I know a lot of people who go mushroom picking or, hunt or, are these areas you should even be messing around in?
Mary, do you want to tackle this one?
So what I was gonna say, so I'm the avid hiker too. And I go to a lot of these historic sites. And the biggest thing is most of it is larger rock. So as long as you're not kicking up dust and you're not actually digging through it, that it's a relatively safe activity just to be hiking across it. Now bringing a dog with you and letting them drink out of the adit drainages and stuff like that, I would not recommend allowing them to do that. And then like if you got little kids with you and they're more likely to start picking through the rocks and things like that, that's where you're going to get into those issues. But just hiking in general, that's a pretty safe activity. Mushroom picking, that is one thing I've never seen mushrooms growing in mine waste. In all the years that I've been mushroom picking, I've only seen them in clean areas, which is good. But I don't know what the uptake, if there was any. Which kind of brings me on do any of you guys know about the Killarney Lake cranberries, the natural cranberries that grow? So those are something we have tested numerous times and those are always clean. Those come back in, they do not uptake. I don't know if you've ever been on a cranberry bog, but it kind of floats on the water. So those are clean ones, but yes. That's kind of something.
Any concern if we do have a wildfire, especially this summer, maybe taking some of the metals and making them airborne?
Yes, if it was in the smelter area, I would be heavily concerned. And we did have a fire up Wardner on the hillside a few years ago, but that would potentially aerosol, all of those heavy metals. So that is a huge concern. We also had a fire out on the Cataldo Flats, down on the Mission Flats a few years ago. That was also a heavy concern. I did do some follow-up dust sampling after that event, and I didn't have any levels that were screaming high from what settled out from it, but I have no clue what, and we don't have air quality monitors in that area. The closest one is in Pinehurst. So honestly, to know what that did, I don't know. But yeah.
I have a question,
Sure.
maybe related to Sarah. Do you or any other organizations work with Silver Mountain for their mountain bike trails? Because that is
It's a
constant.
really good question.
Cause I bike up there like 40 times a year. And I'm
Yeah.
like, "Ooh, it's really bad."
Well,
It is a lot of dust.
there is a lot of dust. The one thing I have to say about it, we've sampled some of the trails, some. When you get above a certain elevation, the smelter smoke did not, it only stayed within a zone, okay? So the higher elevations, you're safer. When you start getting into those lower zones, when you're coming into like Alhambra and into Kellogg and where the trails join into the community, that's where we see the higher levels. But the trails themselves, you guys have ridden so much that
Yeah.
it's eroded down below that smelter layer. So the smelter permeated usually the 0 to 6 inch depth. So most of those trails are below that now, the ruts and everything. So the guys that were riding it in the early days are the ones that I would have been concerned about, to be honest. We have sampled the decon station at Silver Mountain only one time, and it was not very elevated, but that was only one time. It's a very fine line of what they'll allow us to do and what they're scared that we might reveal. So, when I broach those topics with them, they get real quiet real quick. I would love to do more investigative sampling, but yes.
Being in the Mamba Grant is pretty fun.
True. Kind of a dumb question, but does the snow pick up or transfer any of the contaminants?
It's actually a really good question for plowing and stuff. So, the snow when it's falling, no. When they are plowing the snow throughout the communities, they have stockpile areas where they pile it up. Last few winters hasn't been anything impressive, but every spring, my, inspectors, we go out and we actually collect sediments that are mixed in with the snow. And that gives us kind of an idea of what's still out in the community getting pushed around. And so it's really interesting to see there's definitely still contamination present in those sediments. And the upper basin and Kellogg are always more elevated. But it fluctuates throughout the year. So I've got a chart that I keep track of for each community and each snow pile over the years to kind of monitor that.
And then if I could ask, just to kind of go back to your presentation with the bricks.
Mhm.
So I know a lot of the buildings in Wallace are designated as historical.
Correct.
Is there any way to kind of deal with the lead? in
You
the
can
brick?
shellac it, you can seal it in, you can do different, paint. Any of that kind of stuff is gonna help encapsulate it and protect it. So anything that you're doing for the just general maintenance of the upkeep of the building is gonna be good. However, if you're doing renovations where you're removing sections, you're sawing, saying any of that kind of activity, that's where that stuff's gonna get released.
Actually beneficial that a lot of those buildings are designated than as like.
I mean, I don't know you could look at it that way, yes, because that means that it's going to limit alterations that people can do. So yeah, it definitely could be a benefit to view it that way. So, because there's gonna be less damage to them, and you can't just go demolish one without having real justification for it.
Do the building departments have regulations on all of this? Do they say, you have to test this dirt that you're pulling out and remove it in a certain way, and you have to?
For building requirements, we only have my agencies that involved in the excavation part of it. We also have some certain interior modeling projects that require permits, so there's a little bit of that. But most of that's gonna fall back on the lead-based paint rules. And so that's where that would be implemented. However, there's not a lot of enforcement on the lead-based paint thing. I go into, so Wallace has got a lot of lead-based paint on those old homes, and I will drive by and see just handyman pressure washing paint off or scraping, and it's going all over the yard. And that's totally recontaminating the yard, exposing those families. It's a nightmare. One of our local painters who is not lead-based paint certified, he was poisoning his entire family, and he still doesn't care. He's like, whatever, it's not a big deal. It's a nightmare. So, yeah.
Once somebody has an elevated blood level, is that something? That's not a permanent thing?
No,
It's
if
like
you
can.
30 to 60 days is the half-life of lead in the body.
Okay.
So as long as you cut off that exposure, those levels are gonna start dropping naturally. The longer the exposure, the more it can accumulate in your body, in your bone structure, in your organs. So if you grow up in this area, like if you grew up here when the smelter was running and none of the cleanup had been done, a lot of that is stored in the older generation's bones. And as you get osteoporosis, if you break a bone, pregnancy starts releasing those. So we can see a spike in blood levels under those conditions. So that is always interesting. That's why it's so important for us to identify it as quickly as possible so we can eliminate that exposure and get those levels down.
Is lead testing for infants a thing here? In the Silver Valley?
Anyone who lives, works, or recreates here can be tested for free. I've got 2 machines that are up at Shoshone Medical Center that we do a finger poke capillary reading you get within 3 minutes. If those levels are elevated, we do a venous draw and we send that to a lab to be confirmed. So that is then every summer in August, I have a 6-day event where we, any child 6 months through 6 years of age that lives here in the site can be tested, and we pay them $50 per child to be tested. So we test on average about 400 people a year just during that week. So you had Mary Francis, right?
Yeah, you working with
Kyle, a lot of people, a lot of different organizations, so it sounds like help me because it's bureaucracy. So I guess my question is, what are the most difficult situations you work with? How do you get past them? And what would make it easier working with all of these different organizations?
Geez.
Good
Honesty.
question.
So I think that there's two sides to that. I'm going to talk first about what is one of the most important parts of the work that we do, and that's actually coordination with the public. We're working in these communities doing very large projects that are, for lack of a better word, very, very disturbing and disruptive to the community. You know, there's a lot of things that go into that community coordination. I personally, in our organization, we go out and we talk to people face to face. So we go door to door when we're getting ready to do a project and talk to people. Because that's one of those things that we can be as technically sound as possible. But if our projects are not going to be accepted by the communities in which they're going to be implemented, it's going to spell bad news for us when we actually show up to do the work. So that's probably one of the bigger challenges. Luckily for us, what I'll talk about, and I kind of glossed over this as I talked about the creation of the Coeur d'Alene Trust. So there's numerous ways that funding can come about in Superfund. It can be fund lead, meaning it's actually EPA dollars that are going to complete the work. It can be ERP, potentially responsible party, people that were responsible for the contamination. And then you can have these trust models where I'm a successor, I represent a successor to a PRP. But because with our beneficiary being EPA, we're very aligned on where and how in general, it doesn't mean we always agree, but we're all pulling in the same direction for how to get those things done. I think that we actually, in terms of the regulatory agencies and all of the partners that we work with, I think we have pretty good relationships with all of them, and everyone's pulling in the same direction for the most part on these. So, you know, there's not really anything there that sticks out as far as how that relationship or those relationships could be improved. Yeah, it's pretty unique.
I kind of have a little different perspective. Pretty close, but communication is the absolute most important thing. We do have weekly meetings where the agencies all are on the same phone call and talk, so we can try to be on the same page as to what's going on this week. What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? Where I run into problems is where a partnering agency makes a decision without consulting me or talking to me first, and then I step into the middle of it going, whoa, 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 where are we at? Why are we doing this? What, you know? So then that can cause some conflict and issues because we are so overlapping in everything we do, and the authorities can get pretty convoluted and confusing at times. So communication is just so important, and some people are not good communicators, so it makes it really hard. Yeah.
So if you had, for your process for communicating with the public, if you were working with artists, for example, who were able to come up with fun, creative ways to help you in that communication process, that might be something you would be interested in, maybe.
Potentially, yeah.
Potentially. Cautiously.
Cautiously. There are very strict, the way, you know, there are very tight rules on how the trust funds can actually be spent. But I mean, certainly if there's a way, and I think that that's probably why Sharon maybe asked us to come down and talk, is some different perspectives here. And there's so many people that are getting the word out about this. It's not just us, you know, it's like I said, there's a whole web of people that are involved in these outreach efforts. So. Yeah.
Leave those old mine sites at risk of reopening, or are they kind of protected? And then also, can you remind us of the mines that are currently active?
Sure. So the yes and no to the first question. There are sites that, right, They're all privately owned. Most of these are under what's called consent decree. So the Coeur d'Alene Trust was one settlement. There were lots of other settlements with mining companies that existed at the time or still existed in the area, for what they are or are not allowed to do with sites that were under consent decree. So anything would have to be approved. If we've done cleanup there, there are either covenants or restrictions on what can be done there in the future. There are sites that are identified as, potential redevelopment zones. And then those mines still, most of them still own the mineral rights. So, but as we talked, things are done substantially differently nowadays. And then from active mines, we have the Galena mine up in Osborne, the Lucky Friday in Mullen, the Sunshine up in Big Creek out of Kellogg here, and Bunker, thank you, and the Crescent.
We also have the New Jersey.
Yeah.
But that's more up in Murray, but they've got a mill here on the site, so. Yeah. Yes.
I have two questions. Do you guys find that the community is more receptive to work now as technology improves, or less receptive as things are being remediated and they're not living with the damages that people will experience? My second question is, so like, what about like the recreational gold panning type of activity? Like, I have a friend who hangs out in Murray and like just cans all summer.
Yeah.
Desert thing.
Yeah, Murray is for heavy metals, it's not a concern. There's some arsenic, naturally occurring arsenic that does get into the water bodies up there, but as long as you're not drinking it, you're gonna be okay. Gold panning is pretty safe, especially because you're in wet material, so there's not a lot of dust or anything like that. Good one. When I started this job, people had no EPA signs in their windows. The last no EPA sign I saw, the guy is passed away now, and that was like 5 years ago. So I went from seeing dozens of houses in each community with these signs to none. So I think that things are absolutely changing, and I think that there was a lot of pushback in the early days because people saw the cleanup as being anti-mining, and instead, I think people started to then see, no, we're not anti-mining. We're trying to work with the mines to make sure things are done correctly now. But at the same time, they're seeing the visible change from when they were kids and how pretty it looks now versus what it did look like. And so there's been a lot of like, okay, now they're seeing the results of this. And so that's also helped with a lot of those perceptions.
Would you also say that because that transformation has happened, that some people that move into the area now aren't aware of the same risks that
Yes.
were, right? So the
Absolutely.
area has transformed and the barren hillsides are no longer
Yep.
here, and now we hear,
Yeah, the rivers.
well,
no
it's all been
longer
taken
running
care of, right?
gray, so.
It's all good now. There's nothing to
Yeah,
worry about.
And that's the double-edged sword there, that it's scary because these newer generations, they don't remember any of that, the pollution, the obvious pollution. And so they think everything's fine and everything's great. And, like my family growing up, no one was allowed to swim in the South Fork because it was disgusting. And there was also, you could visually see it. And then now, more and more and more every summer, I'm seeing more and more people out there, and it's like, ooh, because those are where I get the exposures when they come to the doctor, and then I get their lab reports.
Does the refining that happens from the current mines still happen here? Are we shipping that problem to another country?
So there's still milling ores here, right? So taking it and down into concentrate form. So that's why we have the tailings pile or the tailings ponds. And then, yes, it is most ores from here are going to the smelter in Trail, British Columbia.
Yeah, so every morning, if you're driving up on I-90, you'll see all these dump trucks, these pumping trucks hauling, and that's the ore ponds that are going up to Trail, British Columbia. So it's like a constant stream every day. These guys make that drive, which I almost wish we still had the rail line in place, because to me, that would have been a lot more efficient, but
Okay, I'm gonna have to wrap it up after your question because we have Carrie, who's gonna be waiting for us. But no, you go, and then we'll
Just
go back.
mentioned, most of your elevated blood levels of kids
Mhm.
come from kids on the banks of the South Fork. Is that
not just no. So where I see the most is from kids that are recreating in either along the South Fork or the lower basin, especially in those really fine sands, like at the Killarney Sandbar. That's where I get a lot of kids. And then the other kids that I get is a lot of times the dads that work at the mines or the mills, and they're not using the dry facilities, or they're not getting their clothes laundered separately. They're washing them with their family's laundry. So I actually test dryer lint when I go into homes, and it's in the thousands of parts per million. It's insane. And then I'll test the clothing, the items themselves, and I've got little baby clothes that I've tested that are 500, 600 parts per million lead. And babies are constantly sucking on their shirts and stuff. So that's where I also see exposures. But those are kind of, the two areas. Okay.
Well, thank you, Mary.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. And again, if you guys have questions, I can connect you with them. I'm sure as you let this absorb, you might have additional questions. We're just like 2 minutes away, but there is no bathroom there. So if you need to go to the bathroom, let's go to the bathroom, and then I'm gonna lead you into where the central treatment plant is. So I'm actually not gonna join you on the tour because I just recently went through the tour, but Carrie St. John is gonna give you the tour. She's the engineer who works at the plant. And just to give you a background of why we're going to the central treatment plant. So the central treatment plant was upgraded, I believe, in 2021 to do a better process of.
Sorry.
We can talk when you talk, so please. I want to hear her.
So the central treatment plant was upgraded recently to do a better job of extracting some of the heavy metals out of the water that's coming in. So it is getting water that's coming constantly from the Bunker Hill portal. And it's got like a pH of like 2 or 3. And then it's also the central impoundment area has about 24 million tons of mine tailings from when Bunker Hill was putting their mine tailing waste there. And it wasn't lined because it was kind of, old school back in the day. And so they actually put in a clay wall along I-90. And they have pumps that are pulling the groundwater out from under that and treating that as well. So both treating the groundwater under the central impoundment area and the acid mine drainage coming from the Bunker Hill portal. And then that is being, once it's cleaned up, then they put it into the South Fork of the Coeur d'Alene River, and it's cleaning up about 98% of all the things we want removed. And Carrie will go into that, but just so you're aware of the history of the central impoundment area. So, and now if you guys want to go to the restroom, I'll close up shop and then we can head over there.
So, anything in
Hey Sharon, you said you're not coming on the tour because you recently went. Does that mean that someone that wasn't here today could schedule a tour at a later time? Or is that a Carrie question?
I probably could schedule it.
You guys don't have to overextend yourselves at all. I just didn't know if it was
Okay.
a thing that happened. Because I know like the Coeur d'Alene wastewater plant, like you can email them and they'll make it happen because they like to do it. But
I can talk to Carrie about it.
Okay.
I don't want to volunteer the
Yeah,
time.
okay, cool.
I could probably arrange it. It might be
Yeah,
nice to have
no,
more than one person.
Yeah, absolutely,
come because,
absolutely.
It's her
Yeah,
time, but,
Yeah,
yes.
Okay, cool.
I would talk
Cool.
to Carrie and I can help coordinate if she's willing.
Yeah.
If we could get more people.
Yes, no, for
1:15.
sure. A lot. So you
Yeah,
know your whole
yeah,
day.
yeah.
Absolutely. This was so great.
Okay.
I wish this had been the first one because it like the foundational information are really, really
Going
good.
down.
Yes. It was just so good. Yeah.
You know,